Welcome to the All About You podcast. People are fascinating, and I believe that everyone has a story to tell of their travels, hobbies, passions, and experiences. I want to get those stories told so they can entertain, inspire, and showcase the amazing talents of people. My guests have taken risks, put themselves out there, created businesses, or taken their passion to the next level. I feel very privileged and honoured to tell you, the listener, those stories in my All About You podcast. Enjoy today's conversation. Welcome to the All About You podcast, and I'm delighted to have with me today award-winning author Sandra Bruce, and we are going to be talking about her writing and her book, The Class. Sandra, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Well, for me, it's an absolute pleasure to be able to do a face-to-face interview, so this is great. So firstly, Sandra, let's talk about your journey in becoming a full-time writer. So as a child, were you a big reader?
As a child, there weren't many books in our home when I was a child. I think my reading started when I started secondary school. I had a fantastic English literature teacher. I read my first grown-up novel through the compulsory reading, which was Brighton Rock by Graham Greene. I then became a fan of Graham Greene. I've read most of his books. Also, a step into science fiction with Day of the Triffids. So I started reading then. I got my first library card, which was very exciting. But I wasn't always lost in books. I had a lot of other hobbies. I was at ballet school. I then joined drama school, amateur, of course. So reading really started when I married my Spanish husband and moved to Spain in 1971. And when I arrived, like most British people, I expected everybody to speak English, and they didn't. And I was very, very isolated, and that's when I really started reading. So I would read anything, Wilbur Smith, adventures, and I think I was reading everything to be somewhere else, because the first years in Spain were very, very difficult. So that's when I started reading. And when I started writing I think I must have been 42, 43. I was very, very frustrated with my job. I was teaching English in an English academy. I'm not a trained teacher. I found it very, very difficult. And also I had some terrible groups of adolescents. And that was what pushed me, frustration, I think, what pushed me to writing my first novel, The Class. Okay, I arrived home one day very, very, very upset. And of course, my children weren't that sympathetic with me. And they said, it's only 3 hours a week. What if it was for the rest of your life? And that's when the idea started. So I asked my children to show me how to turn the PC on, and how it didn't have Office then. The word processor was not as good as now, but I started to write. I said, okay, I'm going to write a novel. Of course, they rolled their eyes to the ceiling and said, okay, that would keep me out of trouble for a while. And that's how it started.
I love the story that right at the beginning when you arrived in Spain, because of the current frustration with not knowing anybody and learning the language, you lost yourselves in the written word. And I think that is the power of books. We can go to faraway places, distant planets, and read all these different things, and reading, as you say, all the different genres is just fantastic, isn't it?
Yes.
But I love the fact that through the frustration of your job took you to the path of becoming a full-time author. At the time, your children rolled their eyes. Are they rolling their eyes now? I suspect not.
No. From the very beginning, they backed me. The fact was that I wasn't in a very good place when I started it. It wasn't the best time in my life. We'd also moved from a small village to the city, which I thought would be more exciting. But with the timetable you have in an English academy, you can't have a social life. Running a house, teaching in the morning, teaching at lunchtime, teaching until 10 o'clock at night, you can't have a social life. I was even lonelier than when I'd been living in, it wasn't a small village, but it was a village where everybody knew me. It was a village where my husband was the head teacher in the English department. So I was very respected. And then suddenly in the city, nobody knew me. And my children were about to fly the nest. They were living their own lives. They did back me, and they did help me a lot, because the first draft of the novel, that took me about 3 months, it was really bad. It was really bad, and I think I knew it was bad, but I gave it to them to read. I gave it to my husband to read, and he said, yes, very nice. But I knew he'd say that. But my children, young adults then, said, no, you can do much better than this. Go back and sort it out. And I spent a year preparing it, writing it, until I was satisfied. And I said, yes, this now is a novel. And then I kidnapped my English-speaking friends and made them read it. They seemed quite impressed. So that's how it started. Then I thought, okay, I've written a novel. Now what? Because this is the difficult part. I was satisfied that I'd been able to do it. But you always want more. You want it to be published. And of course, an English novel in Spain, that is very, very difficult to get published. I sent out a few inquiries to England, but just got the standard reply. Thank you very much. We're not actually taking on any new manuscripts. Normal is normal. Sandra Bruce, who's Sandra Bruce? But I was lucky enough that my son one day came back from university and he said, hey, the University of Lérida in Catalonia has a writing competition for novels, science fiction. My novel is only slightly science fiction. I'll explain that later. And he said, and they accept manuscripts in Catalan, in Spanish, in French, and in English. You only have to send 3 copies of the manuscript. It doesn't cost any money. So I spent the next week printing out in the old printers that you put one page in, turned it over, turned it round and put the other page in. So it took me a long time to print it. I sent it off, and for about a week I was having dreams of winning. The dreams were more like winning a Nobel Prize, I must admit, but I'm a practical person. And after a month, I completely forgot about it. Until 6 months later, when there was a telephone call and a young lady speaking to me in Catalan. And I said, sorry, I can manage Spanish. I'm not so good with Catalan. And she said, congratulations, you've won the writing competition. And we would like you to come to Lérida to pick up your prize, which was 250,000 pesetas back then, which was a lot of money, plus the novel will be published. So I was on cloud 9, and that's when it started. So I think if I can do one novel, I can write another. That's how it began.
Let's go back a bit on this, Sandra. So I think everybody believes they can write a book. But you wrote your first book, you gave it to your husband, and he, as you was going to say, would support you no matter what.
Yes.
Your children were a bit more objective about
Yes.
it. But I guess it's that, just let's do the first one, write it in crayon, it really doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Just get that first one done. And that's with anything. Just make the first draft, so to
Yes.
speak. Then you've got a base to work with.
Yes.
Then you can polish and change and alter and all the rest of it. But it's getting that first one done. What was that process like for you? I mean, let's not worry about the technology bit. Sitting down and writing, how did you work that process?
It's really strange. I don't know. It became obsessive. I would rush back from work and sit down. I had to stop, say 1 o'clock in the morning, thinking, no, you've got a class at 9 o'clock, stop. And it's really, really difficult for me to say exactly how it happened. It just became very exciting. And how far can I take this person? What would happen? What would I do? And that's why the actual beginning of the novel, although it's not the beginning because there's a lot of flashbacks, because the beginning is the end. That sounds odd, but it is. There's a lot of flashbacks. And of course, my first novel, going through a frustrating time, obviously a lot of me was in the novel, and then I started to remember. And as the novel, the protagonist is an English academy teacher, I started way back to why she came to Spain. So I actually used my information to start the novel. When she arrived, when Susan arrives, what happens to her, the reaction with her in-laws, trying to work in Spanish society. And so there's a lot of me there. And one of the problems was that I didn't particularly like Susan. And I know there was a lot of me in Susan. And when I reread what I'd put, I thought, she's not very nice. And this was shocking. It was even worse when I gave to my daughter and said, what do you think? She said, oh, it's you. And I thought, oh dear, it's me. So this was quite shocking, because Susan, the protagonist, is got a very intolerant nature. She's stubborn. She holds a grudge. And my family weren't surprised. So that was quite shocking. That actually made me think and try to change my personality, which is very odd. Then, as I always say, when people say, how much of Sandra is in Susan? And I always say, well, I have it down here. I always say that she holds a grudge. She's intolerant, inflexible. She's a controller, and maybe a little bit wicked. And then I say, everything that follows is fiction. So, but it was really, really self-analysis, and I didn't like the person. That's very odd.
That is quite something, isn't it? I mean, as well as writing the book, this was a journey of self-discovery.
Yes. And it wasn't always very
nice. And it
nice.
wasn't good, was it? It wasn't good.
No.
But I think we all have romantic images of, I'm going to go and write my book, so I'm going to go and spend a month in the south of France. I'm going to have back in the day, the romantic, the typewriter on the balcony. I'm going to sit there with my glass of wine. I'm going to watch the sun, and I'm going to write my blockbuster. In reality, you're running a home. You've got a family.
Yes.
You've got a full-time job.
Yes.
And you're staying up till silly o'clock at night, stroke morning, to do your book.
Yes.
So the reality of sitting on that balcony, watching the sun go down, writing your book, and supermarket, washing, ironing, work is very, very different. That's a huge commitment. Were there any times when you just thought, I just can't do this, this is too much of a commitment?
No, because I was free. I was doing it because I wanted to do it. I was writing because I wanted to do it. It also was self-analysis. And then I started to put into it things that have always interested me, like what would happen if suddenly modern technology, absolutely everything disappeared. How well would I personally cope? While I was writing it, I realized that not very well. There is a scene where, in the novel, where Susan has to find transport to take her class, to get her class out of the city, which is the city of Castellón, which is becoming extremely dangerous. And she realizes that she has always been a hopeless driver. I've always been a hopeless driver. I had to give up after a year. I was more danger than anything else. And that she had to find transport to take 10 adolescents up into the mountains, because that was her brilliant idea, to take them up into the mountains where they would be safe. She hadn't thought it out. She didn't think, yes, but we've got to eat. We have to start from nothing. And she nearly killed them because the winter in the mountains was really, really cold. So this has always fascinated me, starting afresh, living off the land. Fortunately, if you read the novel, she's actually saved, or they are saved, by a very, very old shepherd who helps them, tells them when to plant, tells them when to collect the crops, tells them start getting wood, it's going to be a cold winter, etc. He's one of my favourite characters, Paco, the shepherd. And there is a scene which I love when they arrive to the Masía, the country house. The shepherd is waiting for her with a shotgun. And the only thing she says is, "Hola." And he says, "You're a foreigner." And she's very offended because she's only said one word. And she said, "Okay, yes, I'm English." He said, "Oh, you're English, okay." And puts his shotgun down. And we will find out later, because she's white, because usually the people don't always like the English. And the story of Paco is one of my favourite parts of the novel.
So we don't want to give too much away about the book.
Yeah.
But what about the research for your characters? Were they people you know, or did you create the characters in the book?
There were people I knew. The students were
But the names have been changed to protect the innocent.
Yes. In the novel, they start as stereotype adolescents. There's the bully, there's the know-all, there's, if you've had students, you know what I mean. There's always that one, oh no, he's going to ask a question. And the other one that won't let you do anything. So a little bit stereotype, but yes, they were students I knew. In the story, the teacher has a boy and a girl. I happen to have a boy and a girl. It was easier for somebody who's beginning. You have to write about things you know. Then you can take it where you like. But I mean, I wasn't going to write a novel where I was an Italian architect. I had to write about something. I had to write about something I knew. I knew what it was like to be English in Spain during the dictatorship. I knew what it was like to teach English. And then the rest was imagination, how the story turns into imagination. I enjoyed that part.
I mean, some people say that when you're on the right path, the book writes itself, or the essay writes itself, or the poem writes itself. Other people say sometimes it's like pulling every single tooth out individually and very painfully. So can we talk about your writing process? We've talked about back in the day when printing every page out. What is your writing process? Do you have a routine? Do you have a schedule?
No. I write, no, I don't have a schedule. I don't have a routine. It's in bursts. I'm not that famous. I haven't got a publisher breathing down my neck saying, when's the next chapter coming, etc. So I write when I like. I can be a year without writing and then go back. For instance, after the class, I moved, because of the success, because of actually winning a prize, I moved straight on into the next novel, same theme. This novel is called I Once Was Lost. And it's a parallel story of what happens to the protagonist's daughter. But it's very, very dark. But afterwards, it's a good novel, but it's very dark. So that, I will admit, it was vanity printing. I worked with the Book Guild in England. They're fantastic. The editing was brilliant. So that was quite exciting. I will say that the class is very spontaneous because the class was never professionally edited either. But the I Once Was Lost was. So after that, I had a little rest and my life was getting a little lighter, more enjoyable. And I wrote the next novel, which hasn't actually got a title in English. Originally it was Where To, but it's not printed in English. And my son, who was just out of his studies to become an interpreter and a translator, I said, okay, this is your first job. I want you to translate this book into Spanish. And I paid him very, very badly. But he did it. It was an experience. And then he had just finished his first novel. And there was an event in Castellón City, which was when all the small independent publishers and editors get together and you have fast dates. So you go along with your manuscript and you say, this is why you should publish me. And so my son said, come on, we'll both go. So we were sitting at different desks. You have 5 minutes. And of course, my Spanish went really down the drain. When you're nervous, it went down the drain. On top of that, I had forgotten to put my hearing aids in. So it was a very funny situation. But my son, Jamie, reached an editor called Luis from Boria Editorial from Murcia. And they got on very, very well. And the guy said, I'm taking your novel. His novel is called, well, I have it in Spanish, Sara y el tigre amnésico. The tiger with the forgetful tiger, or with amnesia. And he said, will you listen to my mum as well? And he said, why not? So I went there and he said, oh, I'm taking yours as well. So it was great. A year later, we both had our novels printed, edited and published.
Well, that's a brilliant story.
Yeah.
And the two of you working together
Yes.
is just fantastic.
Yeah, totally different styles, but appreciated of each style. In fact, as my son studied English at university, he went to teach in England. He didn't like that at all. And then he came back and went back to university to study interpretation and translation. So he was very, very good for me because he showed me how to edit, how to correct. So that was the next book that was actually published, and in Spanish it's called Jugar con Fuego, playing with fire. And it's much more lighthearted, but it does have a little bit of the problem with women in Spain. I think it's more than in the husbands, being under the husband's authority, etc. So it has a little bit of standing up for women, but it's a fun novel, and it's about expats in Valencia, and they're getting together, and it's quite funny. I enjoyed writing that. Then I've written, which is not published yet because it's being translated, Nothing But the Truth, which is more fun because it is the class. The class is written in first person, so it's very biased. The class seen through the eyes of the pupils. So that is, but it is the settlement that they establish 200 years in the future, where they're wanting to write, the mayor has ordered the writing of the history of the settlement, and the writer is given the children's diaries. And so you get their version, which is totally different to the class. So that's been fun.
So 4 books in total.
Yes. Well, another one ready, totally different.
Sort of 5 books then we're talking about now. Sandra, that's not bad by any stretch of the imagination.
Well, it's over 30 years, eh?
But I mean, even so, I mean, 5 books is a lot. I mean, it's interesting you were saying right from the very beginning where, you know, let's just get something down on paper. Mm-hmm. Then you've gone through the science fiction, you've changed the class on its head. It's from the perspective of the students, but in the future. It's not the same book, but 5, because often that can happen, and sometimes that can be great, and sometimes it doesn't work. No. But you haven't stuck to the same formula at all.
No. And now what is being corrected, the last thing I've written it in Spanish, and so Santiago has a big job ahead of him, putting it into Spanish rather than my Spanish. And it's going to be called Confessions of a Foreigner, or in Spanish it will be Confesiones de una Guiri. That is going to go through my 50 years experience as still being taken as an English person, even though I'm married to a Spaniard for 50 years. I've got Spanish nationality because when I arrived during the dictatorship, dual nationality wasn't allowed. And as I was married to a Spaniard, I had to, well, apart from we had to remarry, because I got married in the Church of England, to remarry in the Catholic Church because it was a Catholic country. And then I had to become a Spaniard. I had a Spanish identity card when I didn't speak a word of Spanish. So born in Leicester, Spanish nationality. But this is to make people laugh. It's the mistakes I've made. I was so ignorant when I first arrived in Spain. I knew nothing about the country. It wasn't going to be an extended holiday. It was living here.
I think that's a very valid point though, Sandra, isn't it? I have conversations with people who go on holiday, and not necessarily Spain, but go, wouldn't it be fantastic to live here? Living in a foreign country is very, very different to being on holiday where you can do exactly what you want to do for your 2 weeks and, you know, you just have a great time. Living here, getting to grips with the culture, the language, the administrative system of the country, the laws, the regulations, and basically how that country rolls.
Yes.
It is a huge learning curve. And I don't think it's a case of, once you've been here for a year, you'll have it all under your belt. Absolutely
no way.
Not.
No.
But I think moving to another country, I'm very proud I've done it. It's not easy. I'm still getting to grips with the language. And as I always say, every day is a school day and I will always be learning Spanish.
Yes.
But I think it's not for the faint-hearted to move to a foreign country. No. And although you married a Spaniard, and I always think, oh my God, it must be so much easier to grasp the language if you're living with a Spanish woman or a Spanish husband, because it's 24/7 in Spanish. I know loads of people in that situation. They say, oh no, that is still not the way to perfect it.
No, because when I arrived, the second language in Spain when I arrived was French. Obviously, they're neighbours. English was just becoming fashionable. So when, of course, I started straight from working in Barclays Bank, I then got a job in a language academy. And you know nothing about your language. I mean, I was a bank accountant. You know nothing about your language. So all day you're speaking English in your work. Then when you have children, Santiago was finishing his career in English, so it was important that he improved his English. When my children were born, speak to them in English because it's good for them to have a second language. And then again, working in academies, speaking English all day. I didn't learn at all. And I picked it up. My pronunciation was crazy. I was pronouncing what I was hearing. I was coming home and saying things because I worked in a nursery as well. Everybody worked 2 or 3 jobs when I arrived in Valencia. I was picking up Spanish from 3-year-olds. It was crazy. It's not an easy process.
Mm. One thing I wanted to cover with you, Sandra, with me having this podcast, the reason is because I believe everybody's got a story, whether it's their travel, their hobbies, their passions, their jobs, their experiences. We often hear everybody's got a book inside them. Do you agree with that statement?
Yes, I do. If they haven't got a book inside them, they have got stories worth listening to. If you pull people's tongue and they tell us something about their grandma, and then you start, at least for me it's fascinating that a lot of, for instance in the class, a lot of the things I'd heard from my father-in-law, who was taken in where he was 17 during the Spanish Civil War and was actually caught up and taken into the Republican Army at 17. And they said, what were you studying? And he was a quick thinker, and he said, medicine. So he was put into with doctors. So the stories he used to tell at lunchtime, a lot of Paco, the shepherd, is based on that. So, okay, my father-in-law didn't write a book, but he could have, of what went on during the Civil War. He could have. Like when the war ended, not knowing where to go, putting your rifle in a tree trunk so they don't find you armed, going to the bull ring where they'd got all the Republican, I think it was the bull ring, wasn't it, Santiago? In Valencia, bull ring, where they had all the prisoners.
Oh, the conscripts.
Yes, and the conscript, and asking through a window, do you get fed? And they said, no. He said, I'm not coming in then. You know what I mean? That everybody has a story. Maybe we should use also, I think, the tell a story. It would be nice for people who they don't feel they're up to writing, but telling it. It's so important. So these things don't get lost. I mean, the same way that African tribes would sit around the fire and tell stories, and they become legend. Everybody has a story, yes. It's not that easy to write, but yes.
I think one of the interesting things is books are just incredible. We can lose ourselves in a book. We can get involved in a story, take ourselves to foreign climes. We can go to other planets with science fiction. Reading for pleasure is just fantastic. And now there is so much available with audio books.
Yes.
They're becoming, people are commuting, they're listening on their phones and stuff. And I know a lot of people say, oh, if I listen to an audio book, I don't class that as reading.
Oh, it is.
And I think so, because, you're going for a walk with the dog, or you're exercising, or you're doing the dishes.
You're in a different world.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I remember when you could hire cassettes of books from the library, and I just thought they were the best thing ever.
Yes.
I think I remember Carrier's Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy.
Spy? That's right.
And this book was huge. I thought, I'm never going to read that in a million years. But then I came across the cassettes. I mean, I know this is aging me terribly, but I thought that was just the best thing ever. Then they came available on a CD, which, that's great. We all had the Walkman type things. Now we can just listen on our phones.
Yes.
And it's just fantastic. So I always say to people, even if you are listening, still count it as reading.
I believe that.
Definitely.
It's important.
And I think as well, if you're listening to books, it gives you the opportunity while you're commuting, walking the dog,
Yes.
as opposed to sitting down on the sofa with a book. A lot of people say, I struggle to read because I just don't have the time to sit on. Okay, well, that's okay while you're doing the dishes, put something on while you're walking the dog. Count that listening as reading. And I think so many people just think, I need to sit on the sofa with nothing else, nobody around me, and read. No, life is a bit too fast paced for that. If you can do that, then great. That is, a luxury if you can do that.
I totally agree. And before the printed word, that's how stories were told.
It was the medium of storytelling around the fire. I mean, as a kid, one of my fondest memories of my father was he would put me to bed every night and he would tell me a bedtime story.
Yes.
He had 4 that he conjured up in his mind. He never, not once did my dad open a storybook. And it was, okay, which of the 4 would you like tonight?
Yeah.
And I just thought these stories were the greatest. And one of my big regrets of my life, I never got my dad to write the stories down, or I record the stories of my father.
Yeah.
And I always say, if ever I'm talking to anybody, try and get something like that down. Now it's so easy, record it on your phone.
Exactly, yes.
But for kids and for just family, get those stories of your grandparents, your brother, your boyfriend.
It's so
get those stories down.
It's heritage.
It is absolutely. And there's just the sheer pleasure of, in many, many years, and I think this with the podcast is always going to be there long after I've gone. And I'm so proud that I have had the opportunity and the privilege to record people's stories which they can send to their cousin in Australia. It'll be there for years and years to come. I'm very proud that I have been privileged and had the opportunity to tell those stories for people.
Yeah, no, it's very, very, very important. It's like before listening to the radio stories, they were part of my childhood.
Yeah, great memories. We're all sitting round the radio, or all sitting as a family for a TV program and stuff like that. So the fact that we can document these personal stories for future generations is just phenomenal. And I personally think it is such a privilege for me to be able to be part of that.
And for us as well.
So Sandra, just before we finish, any advice for anybody thinking about writing a book, got one done and is a bit stuck, or it's done and they just don't know what to do next? Any advice?
It's difficult. For instance, it's easier to get published in Spain, actually, than in Spain, in Spanish, obviously, than in England. There is self-publication as well. It can be expensive, but the fact whether you're published or not shouldn't stop your writing. Obviously, we all want to be published, and for me, it's been fascinating, the process, working with editors. I've learned such a lot from the 2 Spanish editors I've had, also from the Book Guild. They were fantastic, and when they point things out, you think, wow, yes, it's right. Silly things that she laughed happily. She laughed. You don't need the happily. Or he shouted angrily. If you don't make the readers intelligent enough, if there's been a verbal battle, you don't need to say shouted angrily. Abuse of abusing adverbs and things. I've learned a lot from them. The process is nice. How to get published, I've just been extremely lucky. It is difficult. I don't know how to tell people how to get published, because I have, from my novel I Once Was Lost, I tried to get that published in England, and I have a folder full of rejection letters. But it shouldn't put you off writing. you can always find friends who will read it, and sometimes things work out.
You never know who you're going to speak to and what's going to happen. Exactly.
It shouldn't put you off. I mean, my editor in Castellón, he's fantastic. He says, Sandra, I've got 5 unpublished books. And I said, Carlos, they're unpublished. So, but I've enjoyed writing them, and he could publish them himself. Obviously, it's a nice goal, but it's not. The important thing is to express yourself and work and better yourself. And it's very difficult to take criticism, but you have to.
Comes with the territory.
Yeah. I remember the first time I was criticised, I couldn't sleep for 3 nights. I'm never writing anything again, etc. But no, you have to take it, analyse it, see if you agree or not, and you usually do.
So just go for it.
Yep, go for it.
Yeah.
Because that's all I can say. Go for it. I would love to say, do this, do that, and it'll be published. But I haven't got the key. I've just been extremely lucky, winning the prize, finding small, independent publishers who have dared to take on the challenge. Because for them, if they don't sell, and there haven't been 250, 300 copies, for them, they don't lose money. But if it doesn't sell, they actually lose money, because I haven't had to pay anything. So I think I've been extremely lucky.
Sandra, it's been an absolute pleasure having this conversation with you.
And for me as well.
So thank you very much.
And thank you as well, Sheila. Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed the conversation. Please subscribe on whatever platform you are using. It is free, and if you would like to tell your story, please contact me on allaboutyoupodcast@yahoo.com and let's tell your story.